His dog had not moved in 7 minutes. Cota sat rigid in the passenger seat of the old pickup truck, his thick sable coat pressed against the cracked leather, every muscle locked in place. His amber eyes were fixed on the pale envelope resting on the dashboard. Not the road, not the passing trees, not the frozen fields stretching out on either side of the highway, like an endless white page no one had bothered to write on. The envelope. His ears stood tall and forward, trembling slightly at the tips, the way they only did when he had detected something no human could name.
Hey buddy, come here.
It was not fear. Grady had seen fear in this dog before. Fear made Cota lower his head, flatten his ears, press his weight backward, as if trying to disappear into himself. This was something else entirely. This was urgency. The same urgency Cota showed every time Grady was about to break, every time the darkness crept too close and the world narrowed to a single sharp point of pain that blocked out everything else. The dog would sense it before Grady even knew it was coming, and he would act. Not with barking, never with barking, just presence, just wait. Just those steady amber eyes that said, I am here and I am not leaving. Something was hidden in that envelope, something that had been waiting for someone brave enough to answer it. And the dog already knew. But Grady Weston was not sure he was brave anymore. He was not sure he was anything anymore. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe to support the channel. Now let us begin the story. The road north had begun to thaw, though winter still clung to the land like a stubborn memory that refused to be forgotten. Patches of dirty snow lined the shoulders of the highway, melting slowly under a pale sun that never quite warmed the air. Cold wind moved across the open fields and through the dark forests beyond, carrying the smell of wet earth and a pine resin, and something older than both. Something that smelled like distance, like years. Grady Weston drove with one hand on the wheel of his aging pickup truck, the other resting loosely against the door where the window seal had cracked years ago and never been repaired. The truck rattled when it hit uneven pavement, but the sound did not bother him. After years of listening to helicopters' gunfire and engines screaming across deserts and mountains, a little mechanical noise was nothing. Silence bothered him more. The silence inside a life that no longer had a mission. He was 35 years old, tall just over 6 feet, and built the way soldiers were built after years of carrying too much weight across too many miles in places the evening news never mentioned. His body was lean and efficient rather than bulky. Every movement economical. His face was clean-shaven, sharp-boned with eyes that were gray-blue and strangely calm. Eyes that had seen too many things and no longer felt the need to react quickly to anything. His left knee ached constantly, a dull, persistent throb that worsened in the cold and sharpened on stairs, and reminded him with every single step that the body keeps score long after the mind tries to forget. He scanned the road ahead the way he scanned everything. Terrain first, exit second, threats third. It was automatic. It would never stop being automatic. Beside him, Cota shifted slightly. The German Shepherd was 7 years old, his thick coat a blend of cream gray and black that caught the dim afternoon light like brushed steel. His ears stood upright, alert, even in stillness, and his amber eyes moved between the envelope and Grady's face, with a rhythm that suggested he was monitoring both. Around his chest was a working harness, black with thin, dark red trim, worn but sturdy. The handle on top had been polished smooth from years of use. Cota had once been trained as a military working dog alongside special operations units. Even now, long after those days had ended, he carried himself like he still had a job to do. Grady reached over and scratched behind the dog's ear. "You are quiet today," he said. Cota flicked his ear but did not look away from the envelope. "Smells like old paper, buddy. That is all." But Cota did not relax. His nose brushed the edge of the paper again. A low rumble came from his chest. Not a growl, not a warning. Something more thoughtful, almost a question. 3 hours earlier, a man had walked into the small diner where Grady sometimes worked odd shifts washing dishes and handed him a thick envelope. The man was Daniel Keats, the family lawyer. Tall, thin, somewhere in his early 60s, with the permanent seriousness of someone accustomed to delivering news that changed lives. He had ordered black coffee, sat down across from Grady, and placed the envelope on the table between them. "I have been trying to reach you for weeks," he said. His voice was quiet but precise, the way lawyers spoke when every word had weight. Grady had wiped his hands on a rag and looked at the envelope. "Bad news usually chases me faster than that." Keats gave a faint smile. "Not bad news." He tapped the envelope. "Inheritance." That word had felt foreign the moment it landed on the table. Grady had not had much family left. His father died when he was young. His mother followed not long after. The only person who had ever truly anchored his childhood was his grandfather, an old man who lived in a house somewhere up north near a town called Alder Ridge. But Grady had not seen that place in over 20 years. After high school, he enlisted. Then the SEALs. Then deployments stacked one after another until the world outside missions became something distant and blurry, like a photograph left in the rain. "Your grandfather passed away 6 months ago," Keats said gently. "He left the property entirely to you." Grady stared at the documents. Alder Vale Manor. The name pulled something loose in the back of his mind. Memories buried under years of discipline and distance. The house on the hill, the lake below, a long wooden porch. His grandfather's voice telling stories while the wind came across the water and the evening turned everything gold. Keats leaned back in his chair. There was one condition. He slid a smaller envelope forward. "He asked that you read this personally." That smaller envelope now sat on the dashboard of Grady's truck. Cota had not stopped watching it since they left the diner. The dog's attention finally made Grady reach for it. The paper felt thin and slightly brittle, like it had been written long before it was mailed. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper written in careful handwriting. His grandfather's handwriting. The letters leaned slightly to the right, the way they always had, as if each word was reaching towards something just ahead of it. The letter was short. No dramatic explanations. No sentimental speeches. Just a memory. His grandfather wrote about a summer afternoon long ago. Grady had been 10 years old, sitting on the steps of Alder Vale Manor with a fishing pole leaning against the railing. The lake had been bright under the sun, the air warm and full of insects and birds. Young Grady had asked his grandfather what made a man useful. The old man had laughed and asked what he meant, and the boy had answered with the absolute certainty only children possessed. "I want to grow up and be someone who protects people." Later that same evening, the boy said he wanted to be a Navy SEAL. His grandfather had never forgotten that. The last line of the letter read, "If the world ever makes you forget who you were trying to become, come home before you decide what this house is worth." Grady read the line twice. "Come home before you decide what this house is worth." It was a strange sentence, specific, almost a warning, as if his grandfather had known something would come for the house, as if someone had already tried to put a price on it and the old man had said no, and now he was asking his grandson to understand why before it was too late. Grady folded the letter and placed it back on the dashboard. For several miles he did not speak. Cota lifted his head sharply. The dog's ears snapped forward. Then he turned and looked directly at Grady. Not at the road, not at the trees, straight into his eyes. It was the look Cota used during operations when he had detected something before anyone else could. But there was nothing around them except empty highway and distant forest. Cota placed one heavy paw gently on Grady's leg. The gesture was deliberate, almost insistent, as if the dog were saying something he could not quite put into sound. Grady exhaled slowly. "All right," he muttered. "I guess we are going north." Cota relaxed immediately, as if that had been the only answer he was willing to accept. The road curved through thicker forests now. Tall pines rose on either side, their branches dripping with melting snow. Small streams ran beside the road where ice had begun to crack and flow again. Late winter in northern Minnesota. The world was waking up. Slowly, reluctantly, the way everything wakes up after being cold for too long. The wooden sign marking Alder Ridge appeared suddenly between two leaning birch trees. Population 1,142. The paint had faded under decades of weather, but someone had recently brushed snow from the letters. Small towns had a habit of maintaining their symbols, even when they could not afford to maintain much else. Cota stood up in the seat. His paws braced against the door. His amber eyes scanned the quiet street ahead. His ears twitched constantly, processing distant sounds. A truck engine, a hammer striking wood, wind sliding through power lines. The dog's instincts had always been sharp, but today they seemed almost deliberate, as if he were memorizing the town. The main street was short and practical. A gas station, a diner with a faded red roof, a hardware store with a bell over the door, a narrow brick building that housed the town library. Old pickup trucks lined the street like loyal animals waiting for their owners. The town looked exactly the way small northern towns always looked in late winter, half asleep but stubbornly alive. Grady parked near the hardware store. When he stepped out, the cold wind cut through his jacket immediately. His left knee protested the sudden movement, and he paused on the pavement, letting the joint settle before putting full weight on it. These small negotiations with pain had become routine. Every morning, every staircase, every cold day that reminded the bone and cartilage of things the mind had been trained to ignore. Cota jumped down beside him. The dog shook once, thick fur rippling from neck to tail, then stood alert at Grady's left side. They moved together without leashes, without commands. The quiet coordination of two beings who had survived enough together to stop wasting energy on unnecessary signals. People noticed, not just the dog, though Cota drew attention anywhere. It was the way the man and the dog moved together. Quietly synchronized, like partners who had walked through things that could not be explained to anyone who had not been there. Inside the hardware store, the air smelled like cedar planks and machine oil and old coffee that had been sitting on the burner since morning. Tools hung neatly along wooden walls. Stacks of work gloves and rope coils filled the center aisle. Behind the counter stood a man with broad shoulders and a thick gray beard that spread across his jaw like winter frost. He looked to be around 60. His eyes were calm and observant. "Afternoon," the man said. His voice carried the slow confidence of someone who had never needed to raise it. Grady nodded. "Afternoon." The man's gaze shifted to Cota. "Good dog." Then back to Grady. "Name is Harold. Store has been mine 30 years. Grady Weston." The name caused a faint flicker in Harold's expression. "Weston," he repeated. "From Alder Vale." He leaned back slightly. "Your grandfather fixed half the broken roofs in this town without ever sending a bill." He gestured toward the shelves. "Anything you need for that old house is on the back wall." The statement was not a sales pitch. It was a quiet acknowledgement of something older than commerce. Grady picked up a few basic supplies: nails, a hammer, a coil of rope. Tools felt familiar in his hands. Fixing something physical had always been easier than fixing anything else. Cota remained beside him throughout, nose occasionally brushing the floorboards, absorbing the new smells of town life. The last mile to Alder Vale curved along the edge of the lake like a quiet promise. The road narrowed into a gravel lane, flanked by tall pines whose branches formed a canopy overhead. Then the trees opened. Alder Vale Manor stood on a small hill overlooking a frozen lake. Its long wooden porch stretched across the front like open arms, waiting for someone who had been gone too long. The structure combined weathered timber and stone built in a style that belonged to another era. The steep roof still held patches of snow, and several boards along the railing had warped under years of wind and weather. But the house was standing, solid, patient. That mattered more than anything else. Grady parked near the old barn. Cota jumped down first. The dog trotted across the yard nose low, moving in wide, deliberate circles, as if scanning invisible lines only he could read. The yard had grown wild over the years. Tall grass lay flattened under winter's weight. The wooden fence leaned tiredly in several places. But there was something in the air here. The smell of pine and frozen earth and the faint mineral scent drifting up from the lake. It smelled like memory, like childhood, like the last place in the world where things had made sense. Cota completed his circle and trotted back to Grady, pressed his nose gently against the back of Grady's hand. A nudge, a question. "You okay?" Grady scratched behind the dog's ear. "Yeah, buddy. I think so." He was not sure that was true, but saying it to Cota always felt less like a lie than saying it to anyone else. He walked up the porch steps slowly. Each board creaked under his boots. His left knee complained on the second step, and he shifted his weight to compensate a movement so practiced it had become invisible. The front door was locked, but the key Keats had given him fit easily into the old brass lock. The door opened with a deep, tired sound. The sound of something that had been closed for a long time and had almost forgotten how to open. Inside, the air smelled like dust and wood smoke, long faded into memory. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating floating particles that drifted lazily in the cold air like tiny lost things searching for somewhere to land. The living room looked almost exactly the same as it had 20 years ago. Stone fireplace, long wooden table, bookshelves lining the walls, a rocking chair near the window where his grandfather used to sit in the evenings. Cota entered behind him and paused just inside the doorway. The dog's body stiffened. His nose lifted. He sniffed once, twice. Then he walked slowly across the room toward the far corner, toward the fireplace. Cota stopped in front of the stone hearth. He did not sniff the floor. He did not investigate the furniture or the bookshelves or the dust-covered table. He stared directly at the fireplace itself, at the stone. Then, without warning, he sat down. Not the relaxed sit of a resting dog. A deliberate sit, the command position he used during search operations years ago when he had found what he was looking for. His eyes remained fixed on the stone hearth, unblinking, absolute. Grady watched him. The stillness in the dog stirred something uneasy in his chest. "What is it, Cota?" The dog did not move. His gaze held steady, as if the fireplace had spoken in a language only he could hear, and he was waiting for the rest of the message. Grady stepped closer, knelt down, ran his hands along the stone surface, cold, rough, nothing unusual. Ash stains from 100 fires, an old iron grate. He pressed his palm against the side panel. It shifted, barely, just enough to notice. He pressed harder. The stone section moved inward with a grinding sound that echoed through the empty house. Behind the panel was a narrow space cut into the wall. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had yellowed with age, was a leather notebook. Grady pulled it out carefully. The leather was cracked and dark soft from years of handling. He unwrapped the oilcloth and opened the first page. His grandfather's handwriting, the same careful letters leaning to the right, the same steady hand that had written the letter on the dashboard. The notebook was not a diary. It was a plan, page after page of detailed drawings and notes, a renovation plan for Alder Manor and the old barn behind it. His grandfather had envisioned turning the property into a refuge, not a business, not a resort. A refuge. A place where veterans who had come home broken could find shelter and quiet and purpose again. A place where abandoned animals could heal alongside the people who needed them most. The drawings were precise. Room layouts for the mansion showing beds and common areas and a kitchen large enough to feed a dozen people. Barn designs with stalls and medical areas for injured animals. Supply lists. Construction schedules. Names of people in town who had promised to help when the time came. But the pages near the end were empty. The plan had stopped. The work had never begun. Grady turned to the last written page. In the bottom corner, his grandfather had written a single line in letters slightly larger than the rest. Deliberate. Urgent. As if he wanted to make absolutely certain that anyone who found this notebook would see it before they closed the cover. If someone finds this, please do not let it die here. Below that line, in smaller but equally deliberate handwriting, was something that changed everything. A list of dates and notes. 2 entries recorded visits from a company called North Point Development. Both recorded offers to purchase Alder Manor. Both recorded Arthur Weston's refusal to sell. And beside the second refusal, written in firm strokes that pressed deep into the paper, was a name, Vernon Tate. Arthur had written beneath the name, "He will come back when I am gone. Show him this land belongs to something bigger than money." Grady sat on the floor of the living room for a long time, the notebook open in his hands, the house silent around him except for the small sounds old houses make when they are remembering. Cota lay down beside him. The dog rested his head across Grady's boot and breathed slowly and steadily. His amber eyes watched Grady's face with the patient attention of someone who understood that some things take time to land. The afternoon light had begun to fade when a sound came from outside. Footsteps on the gravel path. Slow, careful, uncertain. The footsteps of someone who was not sure they had the right to be here but had come anyway, because something inside them said they had to. Cota lifted his head. His ears rotated toward the door. He stood and walked to the porch without hesitation. Not with aggression, with attention. Grady followed. A woman stood at the bottom of the porch steps. She was perhaps 64, with silver hair pulled back from a face that carried the kind of beauty that deepened with time rather than fading. Her eyes were blue-gray and slightly reddened at the edges. She wore a heavy wool coat and held a cardboard box against her chest, the way a person holds something that contains the last pieces of a life they are still learning to live without. She looked at the house first, then at Cota, then at Grady. "I saw the lights," she said. Her voice was steady, but thin, worn down the way voices get when they have spent too long talking only to silence. "First time in 6 months anyone has been here. I am Grady Weston, Arthur's grandson." Something moved across her face. Recognition, memory, pain. All of it at once, layered and heavy and impossible to separate into individual feelings, because grief never works that way. It comes all together, or not at all. "I know who you are," she said quietly. "Your grandfather kept a photograph of you on the mantel, the one in uniform." She paused, swallowed. "I am Norah Beckett." Cota descended the porch steps before Grady could respond. The German shepherd walked directly to Norah and stopped in front of her. He lowered his head slowly. Then he sat beside her feet, not guarding her, not investigating her, simply being there, present, close, as if he had recognized something in her that required the specific comfort of a warm body nearby, as if he had sensed the weight she was carrying and decided without being asked that she should not carry it alone. Norah looked down at the dog. Her arms loosened slightly around the box. One hand released its grip and reached down toward Cota's head. When her fingers touched the warm fur between his ears, something in her composure shifted, not collapsed, shifted. Her lip trembled once. Her eyes filled with tears that caught the last of the afternoon light. But they did not fall. She held them there the way she had clearly been holding everything for a very long time. With practice. With the terrible discipline of a woman who had learned to cry only in private. "It has been so long," she whispered, "since a dog trusted me like this." Grady stood on the porch and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some moments were too honest for words. After a full minute, Norah straightened. She climbed the porch steps slowly. Cota walked beside her, his shoulder brushing her knee with each step, guiding her without being asked. She sat down on the old wooden bench near the door and placed the box on her lap. "Your grandfather and my husband Frank were friends for over 30 years, she said. Her hands moved across the top of the box, slowly, reverently, the way hands move across something they have touched 1,000 times in the dark. More than friends, brothers in everything but blood. She looked at Grady. Frank died 3 years ago. Grady leaned against the porch railing and listened. When I heard someone found Arthur's notebook. She began, then stopped, started again. Did you find it behind the fireplace? How did you know about it? Norah opened the box. Inside, resting on a folded cloth, was another leather notebook, smaller than Arthur's, darker. The spine worn smooth from years of handling. She lifted it out with both hands. Her fingers trembled against the cover, not from cold, from the weight of what it represented. She opened it to the first page and turned it toward Grady. Frank Beckett's handwriting was rounder than Arthur's, softer at the edges, but the content was unmistakable. Barn layouts, animal shelter designs, veterinary supply lists, feeding schedules for dogs and cats and horses, medical treatment areas, a plan for the other half of the same dream. Arthur designed the mansion renovation and the overall refuge, Norah said. Frank designed the barn and the animal sanctuary. 2 men, 2 notebooks, 15 years of planning. They worked on this together every Saturday morning at the kitchen table in this house. Coffee and pencils and graph paper and the kind of hope that does not make noise but never goes away. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. Her voice cracked, but she kept going. They started because of Vernon Tate. He had been buying land around the lake for years. He wanted Alder Vale. He wanted the whole valley for a resort. Arthur told him no. Vernon came back a year later with more money. Arthur told him no again. So Arthur and Frank decided the only way to truly protect this land was to give it a purpose. A purpose so clear and so necessary that no amount of money could argue against it. She pressed the notebook tighter against her coat. Cota leaned into her leg. Steady. Warm. Frank drew this barn on paper 15 years ago. Every beam, every stall, every window where the morning light would come through. Her voice broke fully now, not loud, just fractured at the edges like ice cracking on a still pond. He died before they drove a single nail. Arthur tried to continue alone, but he was too old, too tired, too heartbroken after losing his best friend. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. And then Arthur was gone too. She looked at Grady. The tears she had been holding finally fell. Not many. 3, 4. Each one carrying years. 2 men fought to protect this land for a decade. Both died before they could finish what they started. She placed Frank's notebook on the bench beside her. And Vernon Tate is still alive. I promise you, he already knows you are here. The words hung in the cold air between them. Grady looked at the 2 notebooks. His grandfather's on the floor inside. Frank's on the bench beside Norah. 2 halves of the same promise. 2 men who had loved this place enough to spend 10 years defending it with nothing but plans and patience and the stubborn belief that someday someone would come along to finish what they could not. Before Grady could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the quiet. Another vehicle approached the property. This one was not old, and it was not modest. The car that rolled up the lane was new, sleek, black, and polished enough to look entirely wrong on the muddy rural road. It stopped near the house. The engine was nearly silent. Cota's ears snapped forward. He stood and moved to the edge of the porch. His body was still, alert, watchful, not aggressive, but ready. The driver stepped out. He was a tall man in his late 40s with straight blonde hair combed neatly back and a long dark coat that hung with careful precision against his frame. His posture was upright, almost elegant, the practiced confidence of a man who spent his life in rooms where every word was a negotiation and every handshake was a measurement. When he removed his sunglasses, his eyes revealed a sharp intelligence. Cold, but attentive. The eyes of someone who calculated the value of everything he looked at, including people. "Mr. Weston," he called across the yard. His voice carried clearly in the still winter air. He smiled. The smile was polished, professional. It did not reach his eyes. Vernon Tate. He walked toward the porch with confident steps, extended his hand. Vernon Tate, North Point Development. His grip was firm and controlled, the handshake of a man who had spent decades measuring people in the first 3 seconds of contact. "Beautiful property," Vernon said. His eyes moved across the house, the land, the distant frozen lake that glittered under the fading sun. "There are not many places like this left." He reached into his coat and produced a slim folder. "We have been surveying land around Alder Ridge for a new resort development, a quiet, high-end retreat along the lake. Very tasteful, very exclusive." He opened the folder and handed Grady a sheet of paper. The number printed near the bottom made Grady pause. $800,000. Vernon watched his reaction the way a fisherman watches a line. "Your house sits on the best piece of land in this valley," he said calmly. "The view alone is worth the investment. You could walk away with enough to start over anywhere you like." Cota moved closer. The German shepherd walked directly toward Vernon Tate. The businessman stiffened slightly as the large dog approached. Cota stopped inches from him, lifted his nose, sniffed the air around Vernon's coat carefully. Once, twice. His nose wrinkled. A slight pulling back of the lips, not quite a snarl, not quite a growl. Something quieter than both. A judgment. Then Cota stepped back and sat beside Grady. He did not bark. He did not make a sound. But the calm certainty in his posture was unmistakable. Whatever Cota had detected in the air around this man, he did not approve. Vernon cleared his throat softly. "Well-trained dog." "He has his own opinions," Grady said. Vernon smiled again, thinner this time. "Your grandfather turned me down twice. I respected that. He was a man of conviction." He tucked the folder under his arm. "Third time, the offer is double what I proposed before. 800,000 is a great deal of comfort for a man living alone in a house this old." Norah had risen from the bench. She had not spoken during the entire exchange, but her presence had shifted. She stood taller now. She held Frank's notebook against her chest like armor, like proof, like the last piece of evidence in a case that had been argued for 10 years. Vernon noticed her. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition. A trace of annoyance he could not quite suppress. He gave a small, tight nod. "Mrs. Beckett." "Vernon." One word. His name. That was all she said. But the single word carried the weight of a decade, of letters ignored and offers refused, and 2 old men who had stood between this polished businessman and a frozen lake he wanted to turn into profit. The word said, "I remember everything. And so should you." Vernon looked back at Grady. "Take your time, Mr. Weston, but understand that time has a way of deciding things for people who wait too long." He paused. "The land around the lake is changing, with or without this house." He turned and walked back to his car with the same confident stride. The engine started smoothly. The black vehicle rolled down the gravel road and disappeared into the trees like a shadow retreating from light. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, heavier than the cold air, heavier than the snow on the roof. It was the kind of silence that fills the space after a threat has been spoken politely and left to settle into the bones of everyone who heard it. Grady stood on the porch for a long time. Cota sat beside him, watching the empty road. Norah remained standing near the bench, Frank's notebook pressed to her chest, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. Finally, she spoke. "If you do this," she said, and her voice had changed. It was no longer thin, no longer breaking. It was quiet, but steady. The voice of a woman who had carried grief alone for 3 years, and had somehow found in this moment a reason to set part of it down. If you finish what they started, you will not just be fixing a house or building a barn. You will be completing the thing 2 men gave their lives to protect. She looked toward the lake. The last light of the day lay across the frozen surface like a golden cloth. You will be pulling this whole town out of a long, long sleep. Grady looked at the paper Vernon had left. $800,000. Enough to erase every debt. Enough to buy a smaller life, somewhere warmer, somewhere easier, somewhere far away from the cold and the silence and the weight of other people's unfinished dreams. Then he looked at the 2 notebooks. Arthur's inside on the floor where Cota had led him to find it. Frank's on the bench beside the woman who had carried it for 3 years, waiting for this exact moment. He looked at Cota sitting beside Norah, his amber eyes steady and warm. He looked toward the old barn behind the house, its door hanging open, its dark interior, waiting for something he could not yet name. Grady did not answer Norah's words. Not yet. The decision was too heavy for this moment. Too large for a single evening on a cold porch in a town he had not visited in 20 years. But he did not say no. And in a town this small where silence was its own kind of language that meant something, Norah seemed to understand. She placed Frank's notebook on the bench, gently, carefully, the way you place flowers on a grave. Then she descended the steps and walked down the gravel path toward the road, her heavy coat moving slowly in the wind. Cota watched her go. He sat at the edge of the porch and tracked her all the way to the bottom of the hill. He did not follow, but he did not look away until she disappeared around the bend. Then he turned back to Grady and pressed his nose against the back of his hand. Once, gently, the same thing he always said. The only thing he ever needed to say. I am here, and I am not leaving. The 2 notebooks lay on either side of the doorway, one inside on the floor near the fireplace where it had waited in darkness, one outside on the bench where it had waited in a box carried by a woman who had loved the man who wrote it. 2 halves of one dream, 2 lifetimes of planning, 2 men gone, and 1 young man standing between them with a dog who refused to leave, and a question that would not stop echoing in the silence of the old house on the hill. Come home before you decide what this house is worth. The lake turned silver in the last light. The pines darkened against the sky, and Alder Manor settled into the evening with the patience of a place that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally arrive. Morning arrived slowly over Alder Vale. The cold light of early spring filtered through the tall pine trees surrounding the house, turning the frost along the porch railing into thin threads of silver that melted and reformed with each shift of the wind. The lake below the hill was still mostly frozen, though a narrow band of dark water had begun to appear near the far shore, like a wound that would not close. Somewhere in the forest, a woodpecker tapped against bark in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. The evening before, a man named Silas Harmon had driven up the hill with a wooden crate in the back of his truck. He was an old Marine, quiet and scarred, and inside the crate was an injured stray dog he called Rusty. Grady Weston stepped out onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. The mug was chipped along the rim. He had found it in the kitchen cupboard the night before, and when he wrapped his fingers around it, something shifted quietly in his chest. Not a memory, exactly. More like the shadow of one. The feeling of having held this same cup 20 years ago at a kitchen table where his grandfather sat across from him and talked about storms that had rolled across the lake before Grady was born. The memory was not complete. Just fragments. But fragments were enough to make the coffee taste different. Better. Warmer than the liquid inside it. He leaned his shoulder against the wooden post at the edge of the porch. His left knee had stiffened overnight from the cold, and he shifted his weight carefully, letting the joint find its own position. Every morning, the same negotiation. Every cold day, the same reminder. Cota was already outside. The German shepherd stood near the fence body, still and alert, watching Rusty hobble slowly around the barnyard. The injured dog's leg had improved slightly overnight. The makeshift bandage Silas Harmon had wrapped remained snug, and Rusty moved with more confidence than the day before, though he still paused every few steps to glance toward the tree line, as if years of surviving alone had taught him never to trust open ground. Cota followed a few feet behind, not pushing, not crowding, just keeping watch, the way he always did with anything fragile. Grady sipped his coffee and watched them. "You have already adopted him, haven't you?" he murmured. Coda's ear flicked in his direction, but the dog did not turn around. His attention belonged to Rusty right now. Grady understood. Some things required focus. On the kitchen table inside the house, both notebooks lay open side by side. Arthur's on the left, Frank's on the right. Grady had spent most of the night reading them, comparing the drawings, tracing the lines his grandfather had drawn with a ruler and a steady hand, tracing the softer curves of Frank Beckett's barn designs. Two men who had never served in the military, but who understood in some deep and wordless way that the people who come home from war do not always come home whole, and that sometimes the best medicine is not a pill or a doctor, but a purpose, a place. A reason to get out of bed that has nothing to do with yourself and everything to do with something that needs you. Grady had not slept well. The house made sounds at night, small creaks from wooden beams, branches tapping the roof like fingers asking to be let in. And beneath all of that, the silence. The deep northern silence that made a man hear his own thoughts, whether he wanted to or not. He had heard them. The thoughts. The ones he usually outran by staying busy or staying nowhere long enough for them to catch up. They had found him here, in the dark, in the cold, in his grandfather Aurora's house. Grady finished his coffee, set the mug on the railing, picked up the hammer he had bought from Harold's store. Work. Work was the answer. Work had always been the answer. By 9 a.m, he was inside the barn measuring beams, testing the strength of the walls, comparing the reality of the structure with the drawings in Frank Beckett's notebook. The barn was old, but the bones were solid. His grandfather had maintained the foundation over the years, even if he had never started the renovation. The roof sagged in the middle, where snow had accumulated and pressed the timbers down over many winters, but the main supports were intact. The floor was dirt covered in old straw. The air smelled like damp wood and rust, and the faint sweetness of hay that had been sitting in the dark for years. Rusty watched him from a pile of straw near the door. The injured dog had claimed that spot and showed no interest in moving. Cota lay nearby, Two dogs resting in the quiet of a barn that was about to change. Grady heard the truck before he saw it. The sound of a heavy engine climbing the gravel road. He stepped outside and wiped his hands on his pants. A battered pickup appeared around the bend. Behind it came a smaller vehicle, then a third. The first truck belonged to Silas Harmon. The old Marine stepped out with the slow, deliberate movements of a man whose body carried decades of wear but whose will had not diminished. His gray hair caught the morning light, and the scar along his temple looked deeper in the cold air. He nodded once at Grady. No smile, no unnecessary words, just the nod. The one soldiers exchanged when language was too slow for what needed to be communicated. From the second vehicle stepped a man Grady had not seen before. He was shorter than average, but solidly built with thick brown hair and a square jaw covered by a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a flannel shirt under a canvas jacket and heavy boots that had seen real work. "You must be the new guy up at Alder Vale," the man said. His voice carried a friendly warmth that felt genuine rather than performed. "Name is Bert Callahan. I run the grocery store in town. Took it over from my uncle last year." Grady shook his hand. "Grady Weston," Bert grinned. "Oh, I know. Whole town knows. You are the biggest news since Harold's roof leaked during the 4th of July barbecue, and he blamed it on fireworks." He looked at Cota. "That dog is magnificent. He the foreman around here." Cota sat beside Grady and regarded Bert with calm interest. His tail moved once. Approval, maybe. Or tolerance. From the third vehicle stepped a woman. She was tall, perhaps late 40s, with sharp features and auburn hair pulled back tightly from her face. She wore a practical dark coat and carried a medical bag. "Dr. Linnea Frost," she said. Her handshake was brief and firm. "Town veterinarian. Silas told me about the stray." She glanced toward the barn. "May I?" Grady stepped aside. Dr. Frost walked into the barn without hesitation. She knelt beside Rusty and examined the bandage with careful hands. Rusty flinched once, but did not pull away. Cota moved closer and lay down beside the injured dog as if to say, "It is all right. She is safe. Doctor." Frost glanced at Cota. A flicker of respect crossed her face. Then she returned to her work. "The leg is healing well," she said after a few minutes. "No infection. Whoever set this bandage knew what they were doing." She looked at Silas. The old Marine shrugged slightly. Dr. Frost stood and brushed straw from her knees. "I will come back in 3 days to check again. He needs rest and clean water and food. The barn is adequate if you keep the straw fresh." She spoke with the calm precision of someone who trusted facts over feelings and found comfort in competence rather than conversation. Grady liked her immediately. Bert had wandered into the barn during the examination. He stood near the doorway, looking around at the walls and the sagging roof and the old tools hanging on pegs. Then he turned to Grady with the expression of a man who had just been struck by inspiration. "You need a sign," he announced. "A sign." Bert pulled a piece of cardboard from the back of his truck. He had already written on it in thick black marker. He held it up with both hands like a man unveiling a masterpiece. The sign read, "Cota is management. Humans are volunteers." Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh. Dr. Frost raised one eyebrow. Cota tilted his head and stared at the sign as if reading it. "Perfect," Bert said. He nailed it to the barn door before anyone could object. That was how the first day of work began. 4 people and 2 dogs standing in an old barn in northern Minnesota at the end of winter, looking at hand-drawn plans from 2 men who had died before they could build what they imagined. It was not a team yet. It was barely a beginning, but it was something. And something after months of nothing felt like oxygen. They worked through the morning. Silas handled the heavy lifting without complaint. Bert talked constantly. He narrated his own work like a sportscaster covering a game only he could see. And Callahan goes for the difficult nail on the left side. The crowd holds its breath. He swings. He connects. The crowd goes wild. Nobody asked him to stop. The talking filled the silence in a way that felt natural rather than intrusive, like background music that made the work lighter. Dr. Frost stayed for an hour after checking Rusty. She walked through the barn with Frank's notebook in her hands, studying the animal shelter designs with the focused attention of a professional assessing a colleague's work. "These plans are good," she said quietly. "Whoever designed this understood animal trauma recovery." She closed the notebook. "I can help with the medical layout if you decide to build it." Grady nodded. "I appreciate that." She looked at him with the same direct gaze she had used on Rusty's leg. Clinical, assessing, not unkind, but not soft either. "You have not decided yet," she said. It was not a question. "Not yet." She nodded once. "Fair enough." Then she left. Her vehicle disappeared down the hill, and the sound of the engine faded into the forest. Around noon, a 4th person arrived. He came on foot, walking up the gravel road with the slow, heavy steps of someone who had been walking for a long time and was not sure he had arrived at the right place. He was in his early 40s, lean in the way people become when they have lost weight they did not intend to lose. His face carried the deep lines of sleepless nights and long roads. He wore a faded jacket that was not warm enough for the weather and boots that had been resoled more than once. Cota noticed him first. The dog walked to the fence and stood watching, not barking, not tense, just observing. When the man reached the gate, Cota approached, circled him once, sniffed his jacket carefully, then sat beside him. Grady watched from the barn door. Silas straightened from his work. "That is Ridley Nash," he said quietly. "Met him at the diner yesterday. Used to do construction. Roofing mostly." He paused. "He has been on the road a while." Ridley stopped at the gate. He looked at the barn, then at the house, then at the people working. Something moved across his face. Hope, maybe. Or the fear that hope always carries with it. "I heard there might be work here," he said. His voice was tired but sincere. "I do not need much, just somewhere to be useful for a while." Grady studied him. Something about the man reminded him of soldiers he had known after the last deployment. People who looked functional from the outside but carried fractures inside that no one could see and no one had thought to ask about. Cota remained beside Ridley, tail resting calmly in the cold air. The dog seemed satisfied. Grady nodded toward the barn. "Roof could use another pair of hands." Ridley exhaled slowly. The breath came out like something he had been holding for months. "Thank you." By afternoon, 5 people worked in and around the barn. The rhythm of the labor settled into a pattern. Hammer strikes, the scrape of wood against wood, Bert's commentary, the occasional quiet instruction from Silas, who knew more about structural repair than anyone expected. Ridley climbed the barn roof carefully and worked with the focused concentration of a man who needed the work more than the work needed him. Below them, Rusty lay near the barn door, while a kitten that Grady had brought home from town earlier that week batted lazily at falling snowflakes. The kitten was tiny and gray and white, found behind the diner in a cardboard box, held by a boy who said his mother would not let him keep it. Cota had approached the boy first. The child had stiffened at the sight of the large dog, but Cota lowered his head gently, and the boy's fear dissolved into wonder. "Your dog is nice," the boy had whispered. Now the kitten slept curled against Rusty's ribs, and the barn that had been empty a week ago held 3 animals and the sound of people working together. Cota moved between all of them, checking Rusty, checking the kitten, walking the perimeter of the barn, returning to Grady every few minutes to press his nose against the back of his hand, the gesture that meant everything and never needed translation. Late in the afternoon, Grady stood on a beam inside the barn and swung the hammer hard against a nail. The impact rang through the structure. The echo bounced off the stone walls and multiplied, and for a single terrible second, the sound transformed. It became something else, not a hammer, an explosion, metal tearing, the scream of an engine failing at altitude, sand in his mouth, blood on his hands, a voice calling his name from somewhere he could not reach, the voice of his best friend, the voice of the man who had died because Grady had been 30 seconds too late. The world tilted. The barn disappeared. The cold Minnesota air became desert heat. His hands were not holding a hammer anymore. They were holding someone. Someone heavy. Someone whose blood was soaking through his shirt and whose eyes were open but already leaving. Grady. The name came from far away. Grady. Closer now. But he could not move. His body had locked. Every muscle rigid. Every nerve screaming at him to run or fight or do something, but his legs would not obey and his lungs would not fill, and the world had narrowed to a single point of light that was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Then warmth against his leg, heavy and steady and real. Cota. The dog had not barked, had not whined, had not done anything that would startle a mind already shattered by sound. He had simply moved, crossed the barn floor in silence, pressed his entire body against Grady's left leg, leaned into him with all 70 pounds of muscle and bone and loyalty. Then he placed his head on Grady's thigh and breathed, slowly, deeply, in and out, in and out. A rhythm, a metronome, a heartbeat that was not Grady's but was close enough to follow. Grady's right hand released the hammer. It clattered to the floor somewhere below. His fingers found Cota's fur, thick and warm, real, present, here. His hand gripped the fur at the back of the dog's neck and held on the way a drowning man holds a rope. The desert began to fade. The blood on his hands dissolved. The voice calling his name grew quieter. The barn came back. The cold air. The smell of pine and old straw. The sound of wind against the roof. In and out, following the dog's breathing, matching it, letting it pull him back from wherever he had gone. 30 seconds. A minute, longer maybe. Time moved strangely in these moments. But Cota did not move, did not shift, did not look away. He breathed and Grady breathed, and slowly, like a man climbing out of deep water, Grady returned. "I am here," he whispered. His voice was raw, broken, but present. "I am here." Cota pressed harder against his leg. One more breath. 2. Then the dog licked his hand. Once, gently. Permission to come back. Across the barn, Silas stood motionless. The old Marine had set down his tools the moment he saw Grady freeze. He had not approached, had not spoken, had not done anything except watch with the quiet understanding of a man who recognized exactly what was happening because he had seen it before. In others. In himself. Silas met Grady's eyes briefly when it was over. He gave a single nod. Then he picked up his tools and went back to work. No questions, no pity, just the nod. The one that said, "I know. I have been there. You are not alone in this." Bert had fallen silent for the first time all day. He stood near the barn door, his hand still his face carrying an expression that was gentle and serious, and completely unlike the man who had nailed a joke sign to the door 3 hours earlier. He did not speak until Grady climbed down from the beam. Then he said quietly, "Coffee is still hot in the truck if you want some." That was all. It was enough. 2 days passed. The work on the barn continued. The rhythm found itself. Hammer and saw and the steady scrape of old boards being replaced by new ones. Grady threw himself into the labor with the focused intensity of a man who needed his hands busy so his mind would not wander to places it could not safely go. His knee ached constantly. The cold made it worse. Every ladder climb sent a sharp reminder up through his thigh, but he did not stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. And remembering meant going back to the desert. Norah came on the 3rd day. She walked up the hill in the late morning carrying a basket of bread and a thermos of soup. She stood at the barn door for a long time before entering. Grady watched her from inside. Her eyes moved across the walls, the new boards, the framing that had begun to take the shape of Frank's drawings. Her hand rose to her mouth. She stepped inside slowly, walked to the nearest wall, placed her palm flat against the raw wood, closed her eyes. "Frank drew this beam," she whispered. "Right here, exactly here. He said the morning light would come through that window and fall across the center of the barn." She opened her eyes. They were wet, but steady. He was right. She stood there for a full minute with her hand on the wall. Cota walked to her side and sat down. Not nudging, not demanding attention, just present. The way he had been present on the porch the first day she came. The way he seemed to know exactly when someone needed the simple comfort of a warm body nearby without being asked for anything in return. Then Norah turned and walked out of the barn. Quickly. Eyes reddened. She did not look back. Cota followed her to the gate, sat down, watched her walk all the way to the bottom of the hill. He did not move until she was gone. Then he returned to the barn and lay down beside Rusty and the kitten. His amber eyes tracked Grady's movements for a long time afterward. She was not ready yet. Grady understood that. Some people needed to approach their grief in stages, the way you approach a fire. Close enough to feel the warmth. Not so close it burns. That evening, Cota limped. Grady noticed it immediately. The dog was crossing the yard after his evening patrol when his front right leg hitched slightly. Just once. But once was enough. Grady was beside him in 3 steps. "What happened? Let me see." He knelt in the cold grass and took Cota's paw in his hands. A thin cut ran across the pad. Not deep. Not bleeding heavily. A piece of old wire fencing buried in the yard had caught the skin when Cota stepped on it. The kind of minor injury that would heal in days with proper care. But Grady's hands were shaking. He lifted Cota. All 70 pounds of the dog gathered against his chest. Cota did not resist. He pressed his head against Grady's shoulder and let himself be carried. Grady walked fast, then faster. His knee screamed, but he did not slow down. He reached his truck, placed Cota carefully on the passenger seat, and drove into town with both hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Dr. Linnea Frost answered her door in a heavy sweater and reading glasses. She took one look at Grady's face and stepped aside without a word. In her small clinic behind the house, she examined Cota's paw under a bright light, cleaned the cut, applied antiseptic, wrapped a light bandage around the pad. The entire process took less than 10 minutes. "He will be fine," she said. "Small cut, clean edges. Keep the bandage dry for 2 days, and he will forget it happened." Grady sat on the floor beside the examination table. His hands were still trembling. His breathing had not fully settled. Cota lay on the table with his head resting on his front paws, watching Grady with the patient calm of a creature who understood that this reaction was not about a cut paw. Dr. Frost removed her gloves and leaned against the counter. She studied Grady for a long moment, not with pity, with the same clinical precision she applied to everything, assessing, understanding, choosing her words with care. "The dog is fine," she said again, softer this time. "The question is whether you are." Grady did not answer. "You carried a 70-pound dog half a mile for a cut that a Band-Aid could have handled." She continued, "Your hands have not stopped shaking since you walked in. Your breathing is elevated and your pupils are dilated." She paused. "I am a veterinarian, not a psychologist, but I have spent my career reading the body language of creatures who cannot tell me what hurts." She looked at him directly. "What are you really trying to fix, Grady the barn, or yourself?" The question landed in the small, bright room like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled outward and touched everything. Grady looked at Cota. The dog looked back at him, steady, warm, unbroken. "I do not know," Grady said. It was the most honest thing he had said in months. Dr. Frost nodded. "That is actually a good answer." She handed him a bottle of antiseptic. "For the bandage, change it tomorrow. And Grady." She waited until he met her eyes. "The fact that you ran here carrying him tells me something important. It tells me you still have the capacity to care about something more than yourself. That is not weakness. That is the beginning of something." He drove home slowly. Cota sat in the passenger seat with his bandaged paw resting carefully on the dashboard. The dog watched the road ahead with his usual calm attention. Grady reached over and placed his hand on Cota's neck. The fur was warm. The heartbeat beneath it was steady. "Sorry I panicked," he said quietly. Cota leaned into his hand. Forgiveness, if dogs even needed to give it, was never complicated. The days that followed brought cold wind and progress in equal measure. Vernon Tate did not return in person, but his presence hung over the valley like weather. Sheriff Ray Dawson stopped by one afternoon. He was a tall man in his early 60s with the weathered face of someone who had spent decades outdoors and the calm authority of someone who had never needed to prove it. He leaned against his truck and watched the work on the barn for a while before speaking. "North Point has been talking to landowners south of the lake," the sheriff said. "Making offers, applying pressure. Nothing illegal, but not gentle either." Grady wiped his hands on a rag. "What kind of pressure?" The kind that comes with lawyers and paperwork and the suggestion that selling now is better than watching your property value drop when a resort goes up next door. The sheriff's weathered eyes drifted toward the lake. Vernon Tate has been patient. He waited for your grandfather to pass. Now he is moving. Vernon Tate had played the long game. He had waited for Arthur to die, for Frank to die, and now he was waiting for a 35-year-old man with no ties and a bad knee and 800,000 reasons to walk away. He knows you are the weak link, the sheriff said not unkindly. Young, unattached, no history here, no reason to stay. He looked at Grady. Are you a reason to stay? Grady did not answer. The sheriff nodded slowly, as if the silence itself was informative. Then he drove away. That night, the storm came. It arrived without warning. One moment the sky was clear and cold, and filled with more stars than Grady had seen in years. The next clouds rolled across the valley like a dark curtain being drawn. The wind hit first, sharp and sudden and angry. Then the snow. Not gentle flakes drifting lazily downward, but hard pellets driven sideways by gusts that slammed against the windows and made the old house groan. Grady sat in the living room. The fire he had built in the stone fireplace cast orange light across the walls. The 2 notebooks lay on the table beside him. Cota lay on the rug at his feet, his bandaged paw tucked beneath his chest. The wind screamed. It came in waves, rising and falling, rising higher. A sound like something tearing, like metal, like the rotor of a helicopter straining against altitude, like the last sound he heard before everything went wrong. The room shifted. The fireplace became a wall of sand. The orange light became fire, not warm fire, burning fire. The smell of smoke, the taste of dust, his hands gripping fabric, someone's shirt, pulling, dragging, a voice saying his name over and over and over, his friend's voice, his best friend, the man who had trusted him with his life, the man whose life he had failed to save because 30 seconds was not enough. 30 seconds was never enough. 30 seconds was the distance between alive and gone, and it could not be crossed no matter how fast you ran. Do not let me die here. The words, his friend's last words, the same words written on the last page of his grandfather's notebook. Do not let it die here. The same plea, the same desperation, the same impossible request from someone who needed him to do the one thing he had proven he could not do. Save it. Save them. Save anything. The room was gone. The fire was gone. He was in the desert, on his knees. His hands were red. His friend's eyes were open, but there was nothing behind them anymore. Nothing except the reflection of a sky that did not care. And Grady was screaming, but no sound came out, and the helicopter was too far, and the medic was too late, and the 30 seconds had already passed, and they would never come back. Then wait, on the bed, beside him, heavy and warm and real. Cota had done something he had never done before. He had jumped onto the bed. This was forbidden. This had always been forbidden. In 7 years of partnership, Cota had never once violated the boundary of the sleeping space. He slept on the rug. He slept beside the door. He slept wherever Grady pointed, and he stayed there until morning. But tonight, the dog broke the rule. Cota lay down directly beside Grady, pressed his entire body against his side, chest to ribs, shoulder to shoulder. The dog's warmth seeped through the blanket and into the cold, rigid muscles beneath. Cota placed his head on the pillow beside Grady's head. His breath moved slowly across Grady's face. In and out. In and out. The steadiest sound in the world. The most reliable rhythm left. Grady could not speak. The desert was still there. The blood. The voice. But Cota was there too. Present and warm and impossibly real. An anchor made of fur and loyalty and the stubborn refusal to let his partner drown alone. Grady's hand found the dog's chest. He pressed his palm against it and felt the heartbeat. Strong, slow, certain. A heart that had never doubted anything. A heart that did not know how to quit. The tears came without permission. Grady Weston, who had not cried in years, who had trained himself to lock every feeling behind a wall of discipline and silence, who had survived things that would have broken lesser men by simply refusing to feel them, tried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just tears running sideways across his face and soaking into the pillow while his hand pressed against the heartbeat of the only soul in the world who had never once looked away. Cota did not move, did not pull back, did not shift or adjust or do anything except breathe and be warm and stay. The storm raged outside. Inside, a man held onto a dog and let himself break. In the morning, the damage was clear. The storm had torn a section of the barn roof away. Boards lay scattered across the yard like broken teeth. The wall on the north side had buckled inward. Straw and tools and debris covered the barn floor. 2 weeks of work undone in a single night. Grady stood in the doorway and stared at it. Cota stood beside him. Rusty and the kitten had been moved to the house during the storm and were safe, but the barn looked like something that had given up. Vernon Tate's offer sat on the kitchen table inside. $800,000. The number pulsed in the back of his mind like a second heartbeat. He looked at the 2 notebooks. Arthur's plans for the mansion, Frank's plans for the barn. 15 years of work drawn on paper by 2 men who believed in something they never got to build. And now the building itself had failed. The structure had collapsed. Not entirely, not beyond repair, but enough. Enough to make a man wonder if the universe was trying to tell him something. The thought arrived slowly, like poison. You are not enough. You were not enough to save your friend. You were not enough to be here when your grandfather died. You were 30 seconds late in the desert and 20 years late coming home, and now you are standing in front of a broken barn pretending you can finish something that 2 better men could not. Bert's sign lay in the mud. Cota is management. Humans are volunteers. The cardboard had dissolved in the rain. Grady went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, stared at the phone in his hand. He called Silas. The old Marine answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was gravelly and calm as always. I think I should call Vernon, Grady said. Silence on the other end. Long. Heavy. The kind of silence that fills the space when someone hears something they have been dreading. Say that again, Silas said. The barn is wrecked. Half the roof is gone. Vernon has been buying land on every side. The sheriff says he is applying pressure to everyone around the lake. I am one man with a bad knee and a dog and 2 notebooks full of dreams that belong to dead people. I am not enough for this. They were not enough for this. What makes you think I can do what they could not? More silence. Then Silas spoke, and his voice, for the first time since Grady had known him, cracked. My son died in Fallujah, Silas said. He was 22 years old. Name was Marcus. He played guitar. Badly. He sang in the shower every morning, and his mother used to throw a towel at the bathroom door to make him stop. Grady closed his eyes. The last letter he wrote home said one thing that mattered. One line out of 2 pages of jokes and complaints about the food. He wrote, "Dad, do not let anyone have to carry this alone." Silas paused. The sound of his breathing came through the phone like something being held together by will alone. "I have carried it alone for 14 years, Silas continued. "Every single day. I wake up and I carry it, and I go to sleep and I carry it, and the only thing that changes is the weight gets heavier because there is no one to share it with." Another pause. Then the voice hardened. Not with anger, with certainty. "Quitting is not rest, Grady. Quitting is exile. I have been in exile for 14 years. I know what it looks like. I know what it tastes like. And I am not letting you walk into it." The line was quiet. "2 men already died trying to protect that place," Silas said. "If you sell it, they did not just die. They failed. And so did their grandson, and so did the woman who has been carrying her husband's notebook for 3 years, waiting for someone to open it." Grady pressed his forehead against the cold table. "You called me to ask permission to quit," Silas said. "I am not giving it." The call ended. Grady sat in the kitchen for a long time, the notebooks on the table. Vernon's offer beside them, the storm damage visible through the window. Everything logical pointed in one direction. Take the money, leave. Start over somewhere warm. Let someone else carry the dead men's dreams. He stood up, walked to the bedroom, pulled his bag from under the bed, began putting things inside, clothes, the few possessions he had brought. The letter from his grandfather. He zipped the bag and carried it to the front door. He reached for the handle. Cota was already there. The German shepherd stood directly in front of the door, not beside it, in front of it. His body centered perfectly in the frame, his paws planted wide, his shoulders square, his ears upright. His amber eyes locked onto Grady's face with an intensity that made the air in the room feel heavier. He did not bark. He did not growl. He did not whine or pace or show any sign of distress. He simply stood, solid, immovable, present, the way a wall stands, the way a mountain stands. The way the only thing left in the world that loves you without condition stands when it knows you are about to make the worst mistake of your life. "Move," Grady said. Cota did not move. "Cota, move." Nothing. The dog's eyes held his. Steady. Calm. Absolute. Not challenging. Not angry. Just certain. The certainty of a creature who had spent 7 years learning every signal his partner's body made, and who knew with the precision of a heart that had never been wrong that this was not a door that should be opened. Grady stepped to the left. Cota shifted with him, blocking the gap. Grady stepped to the right. Cota moved again. Smooth, silent, filling the space. The bag felt heavy in Grady's hand. Heavier than the clothes inside it, heavier than anything he had ever carried across any desert or mountain or battlefield. Because this weight was not physical, it was the weight of everything he was trying to leave behind. The notebooks, the barn, the people who had come to help. Norah Beckett standing in the barn with her palm against a wall her husband had drawn on paper 15 years ago. Silas Harmon driving through the snow to deliver an injured dog to a stranger. Bert Callahan nailing a joke to a barn door because laughter was the only medicine he knew how to prescribe. Dr. Linnea Frost kneeling beside a stray and then asking the question no one else had dared to ask, and Cota standing in front of a door, saying the only thing he had ever needed to say. I am here, and I am not leaving, and neither are you. Grady's knees buckled, not from the injury, from something deeper, something that had been holding him upright for months through sheer force of will, and had finally, in this moment, in front of this dog, in front of this door, run out. He dropped the bag, sank to his knees on the wooden floor. His hands found Cota's fur. His fingers buried themselves in the thick, warm coat at the dog's neck and held on. His forehead pressed against Cota's shoulder, the solid, warm, breathing shoulder of the only soul who had never once left. I am tired, Grady whispered. I am so tired. Cota leaned into him, the full weight of the dog pressing against his chest, warm and steady and real. Then Cota licked his hand. Once, slowly, twice, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been waiting years to be finished. Stay. Grady stayed. He stayed on the floor with his arms around the dog for a long time. The light through the windows shifted from gray to pale gold as the morning advanced. The house was quiet. The storm was over. Outside, the damaged barn waited. Inside, 2 notebooks full of other people's dreams waited. The offer of $800,000 waited on the kitchen table. But Grady was done running. He reached for his phone, typed 2 words, and sent them to Silas Harmon. Keep going. Within an hour, Silas was there, then Bert, then Ridley Nash, who had been sleeping in his truck at the edge of town, and came up the hill with sawdust still in his hair. Then Harold from the hardware store carrying lumber in the bed of his old truck without being asked. They stood in the yard and looked at the damaged barn, and no one spoke for a moment. Then Bert said, "Well, guess management has decided we are not quitting." He looked at Cota. The dog sat beside Grady. Bert grinned. "All right then. Someone hand me a hammer." They worked, all morning, all afternoon. Boards replaced, beams reinforced. The wall on the north side straightened and braced. Ridley moved across the roof with the quiet focus of a man who had found the thing he needed. His hands worked steadily, and his face carried an expression that was almost peaceful. Silas worked beside him without speaking. The old Marine's silence was different now, less heavy, less isolated. It was the silence of a man who had shared something painful and found to his surprise that the sharing had not destroyed him. Late in the afternoon, a figure appeared at the bottom of the hill. Norah Beckett climbed the gravel path slowly. She carried nothing this time. No box, no notebook, just herself. Her silver hair caught the low sun. Her coat moved in the wind. She walked through the gate, across the yard, past the trucks and the scattered lumber and the men who paused in their work to watch her. She walked directly into the barn. She stood in the center of the space. The new beams rose around her. The repaired walls held firm. The shape of her husband's design was becoming real. Wood and nails and human effort turning 15 years of paper dreams into something you could touch. She placed her hand on the nearest beam, closed her eyes, and this time she did not leave. "Frank would have loved this," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the barn like a bell. Clear, certain, unbreaking. Then she sat down on a hay bale near the wall. She folded her hands in her lap, and she stayed. Cota walked to her, sat beside her, leaned his weight gently against her leg. Norah placed one hand on his head and the other on the beam beside her, and she breathed. She breathed. And in the barn that her husband had drawn, and that strangers were building, and that a dog had refused to let a broken soldier abandon Norah Beckett, finally stopped carrying her grief alone. Bert appeared in the barn doorway. He was holding a new piece of cardboard. He had written on it with the same thick black marker. The letters were slightly uneven this time, as if his hand had been less steady than before. The sign read, "Still here. Still building. Still not quitting." He nailed it to the beam beside the door. Then he looked at it for a moment and added something smaller underneath in pencil. Grady had to step closer to read it. It said, "For Arthur and Frank, and for the ones still finding their way home." Nobody spoke. Bert turned away and picked up his hammer and went back to work. And for the rest of the afternoon, the man who never stopped talking did not say another word. As the sun dropped lower, Grady found a moment alone near the fence. He leaned against the post and watched the valley. His body ached everywhere, not just the knee. His shoulders burned from lifting boards all day. His hands were raw and cracked. His back had stiffened into a shape that would take hours to undo. But the pain was different today. It was honest pain. Earned pain. The kind that came from building something rather than surviving something. And for the first time in 14 months, the pain did not make him want to stop. It made him want to keep going. Because somewhere on the other side of this exhaustion was a barn that 2 dead men had dreamed about and 5 living people were building. And that was worth every ache in his body. Cota appeared beside him. The dog pressed his nose against the back of Grady's hand. Once. Gently. The daily report. The daily question. The daily answer, all wrapped into one gesture that contained more truth than any sentence Grady had ever spoken or heard. "I am here. Are you here too?" "Yeah, buddy," Grady said quietly. "I am here." Cota leaned against his leg. The weight was warm and familiar and necessary. They stood together watching the light change across the lake, the frozen surface beginning to show cracks where the water beneath was slowly, patiently, inevitably pushing towards spring. That evening, after the others had gone, Grady stood on the porch of Alder Manor and looked out across the valley. The lake was changing. More dark water showed each day along the edges. The snow was melting. Spring was coming, and with it, the soft ground that would make construction impossible until autumn. Sheriff Ray Dawson had stopped by at sunset. He parked his truck near the fence and walked up the hill slowly, hands in his jacket pockets, his eyes moving across the property with the careful attention of a man who had spent 30 years reading landscapes for signs of trouble. He stood beside Grady on the porch for a while without speaking. They watched the last light slide across the frozen lake. The sheriff's breath made small clouds in the cold air. "I have lived in this valley my whole life," the sheriff said eventually. "I watched your grandfather grow old in this house. I watched Frank Beckett drive up this hill every Saturday morning with his notebook and his coffee and sit at that kitchen table for hours. 2 old men planning something they never got to build." He paused. "I always wondered if anyone would come along to finish it." He turned to Grady. His weathered face carried an expression that was not quite hope and not quite sadness. Something between the two. Something that only existed in small towns where people watched their neighbors grow old and die and wondered if anything they built would outlast them. "The thaw is coming faster than expected," the sheriff said. "Ground around the lake will be mud within 2 weeks. maybe less. If you want that barn foundation set properly on solid earth, you have a narrow window. After that, the ground will not firm up again until October. He looked at the barn, at the new boards gleaming pale against the older wood, at the roof that was half repaired and half open to the sky. And I do not think Vernon Tate is a patient man for another 6 months. He has waited 10 years. He will not wait 10 more. The deadline was not legal. It was the earth itself. The land his grandfather had loved would literally soften beneath their feet if they waited too long, and Vernon Tate would not wait 6 months for a young man with a bad knee and a broken spirit to find his courage. The sheriff placed his hat back on his head. "For what it is worth," he said, "your grandfather always believed someone would come. He told me that once, maybe 2 years before he passed. He said the house would find the right person when the time was right." He looked at Cota. The dog sat beside Grady Amber Eyes, steady ears forward. "I think he might have been right about more than just the person." The sheriff walked back to his truck. The engine started. The headlights swept across the yard as he turned around. Then the truck disappeared down the gravel road, and the sound of the engine faded into the forest. Grady stood on the porch in the growing dark. The stars were beginning to appear above the tree line, cold and sharp and impossibly far away. The lake had turned from silver to black. The barn stood against the sky like a promise that was half kept and half still waiting. He looked at the work that had been done. He looked at the work that remained. He thought about 5 people who had shown up without being asked, and a woman who had finally sat down and stayed, and a dog who had stood in front of a door and refused to let him leave. He thought about his grandfather writing in a notebook by firelight, about Frank Beckett drawing a barn that existed only on paper, about 2 men who had believed so deeply in something that they spent the last decade of their lives defending it with nothing but patience and hope, and the stubborn faith that someone would come along to finish what they could not. He looked at Cota sitting beside him on the porch, amber eyes scanning the darkening valley with the quiet vigilance that never shut off. The dog who had crossed every desert and climbed every mountain and walked through every darkness beside him without once looking for the exit. "We have 10 days, Grady said. Cota's ears shifted forward. His tail moved once against the wooden porch. A single thump. And in the language they had shared for 7 years, the language built not from words, but from gestures and glances, and the unspoken understanding between 2 souls who had survived the worst of everything together, the dog's answer was as clear as it had ever been. "Then we had better get started." The first day of the 10 they had left began before the sun touched the valley. Grady Weston was awake at 4 in the morning. Not from nightmares this time. Not from the wind or the cold or the sounds the old house made when it shifted in the dark. He was awake because there was work to do, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the work felt like something he was moving toward, rather than something he was hiding behind. He dressed in the gray light. His left knee protested when he stood the joint stiff and swollen from days of labor, and he paused beside the bed to let it settle. The negotiation took longer this morning. The cold had deepened overnight, and the floor beneath his feet felt like ice. He pressed his palm against the kneecap and waited. 3 breaths. 4. The pain eased from sharp to dull, and he stood fully. Cota was already at the door. The German shepherd's bandaged paw had healed well over the past 2 days. He barely favored it now. His amber eyes caught the faint light from the window and held it like two small lamps burning in the dark room. His tail moved once when Grady reached for his jacket. "Yeah," Grady said. "We're going." Outside, the air smelled like frost and pine, and the particular stillness that only exists in the hour before dawn, when the world has not yet decided what kind of day it will be. The lake below the hill was darker than usual. More open water showed along the edges now. The ice was retreating. The thaw was coming. 10 days. 9, really. Today was already burning. By 6 in the morning, Silas Harmon's truck was parked beside the barn. The old Marine had brought lumber. Not from Harold's store. From his own property. Beams he had been saving for a project he never started. He unloaded them without explanation and began measuring against Frank Beckett's drawings. Bert Callahan arrived at 7 with coffee for everyone and a new sign. This one read, "Day 1 of 10. No excuses." Cota is watching. He nailed it to the fence post near the gate. Ridley Nash came on foot again. He had found a room above the diner in town and was paying for it with dishwashing shifts. His face looked different this morning. Less hollow, less hunted. There was something in his eyes that had not been there a week ago. Purpose, maybe, or the beginning of it. Dr. Linnea Frost arrived at 8. She did not have patience until the afternoon, and she had brought Frank's notebook with annotations she had made in the margins overnight. Specific suggestions for the animal treatment area, drug storage requirements, drainage for the washing station, practical details from a practical mind. They worked. The rhythm of the days that followed was relentless and beautiful. Hammer strikes began at dawn and did not stop until the light failed. The barn grew around them like something alive. Walls straightened, beams locked into place. The sagging roof was stripped and reframed with the lumber Silas had brought. Ridley moved across the high structure with a confidence that transformed him. Up there, balanced on narrow boards with the wind pulling at his jacket and the valley spread out below him, he was not a man who had lost everything. He was a man who knew exactly what he was doing. His hands were sure. His movements were precise. He placed each nail with the care of someone who understood that the things we build must be strong enough to hold the weight of the people who will need them. Cota supervised. That was the only word for it. The German shepherd moved between workstations throughout the day, checking each person with a nose pressed briefly against their hand or their leg, then moving on to the next. He checked Rusty in the corner where the injured dog rested on clean straw. He checked the kitten who had grown bolder and now wandered freely through the barn, occasionally batting at sawdust that floated in the sunlight. He checked the perimeter, walking the fence line twice every morning and once every evening, nose low, ears forward, reading the landscape the way he had been trained to read it years ago in places far more dangerous than this. And he checked Grady. Every few minutes, a press of the nose against the back of the hand. A glance held for 2 seconds longer than necessary. The constant quiet question that never needed words. "You okay still here?" "Still holding, still here, buddy," Grady would say each time. And each time he said it, the words felt a little more true. On the 4th day, something happened that nobody expected. Ridley was working on the crossbeam above the main doorway. The beam was heavy and required precise placement. He had climbed the temporary scaffolding they had built from salvaged lumber and was positioning the beam when the board beneath his right foot cracked. The sound was sharp and sudden. The wood split lengthwise and Ridley's leg dropped through the gap. His body twisted. His hands grabbed for the beam, but the angle was wrong, and his fingers slid across the surface without catching. For one terrible second, he hung in the air, one leg through the scaffolding, both arms reaching for something solid, the ground 12 feet below him. Cota moved before anyone else understood what was happening. The dog had been lying near the barn door. At the sound of the crack, he was on his feet instantly. He crossed the barn floor in 4 strides. When Ridley's body swung sideways and his jacket caught on a protruding nail, Cota was already beneath him. The dog jumped, not high. Dogs are not built for height, but high enough. His jaws closed on the collar of Ridley's jacket, and he pulled. 70 pounds of German Shepherd pulling backward with every ounce of strength in his body. It was not enough to lift a man, but it was enough to change the angle. Ridley's swing shifted. Instead of falling straight down, his body swung inward toward the scaffolding. His hands found the beam. His fingers locked around it. He held. Silas was there 3 seconds later. The old Marine grabbed Ridley's belt and hauled him upward with a strength that seemed to belong to a much younger man. Ridley came up, gasping, his face white, his hands shaking. They got him down to the ground. He sat on the barn floor for a long time. His breath came in ragged gasps. His right knee was scraped and bleeding through his torn jeans. His hands trembled against the dirt. Cota stood beside him. The dog was panting hard. His muscles quivered from the effort of the jump, but he did not move away. He stood directly beside Ridley and waited. Ridley looked at the dog. His eyes were wet, not from the fall, from something else. Something that the fall had shaken loose from wherever he had been keeping it locked. He put his arms around Cota's neck, pressed his face into the thick fur, and said in a voice so quiet that only the dog could hear it, "I owe you one." Cota leaned into him, steady, warm, the same way he leaned into everyone who needed something they could not ask for with words. Bert stood nearby. For once, he had nothing funny to say. He looked at the broken scaffolding, then at Ridley, then at the dog. Then he walked outside and stood in the yard for several minutes with his hands in his pockets, looking at the sky. When he came back, and his eyes were slightly red, but he picked up his hammer and said, "All right, day 4. We are behind schedule. Someone fix that scaffolding before management files a complaint." He glanced at Cota. The dog wagged his tail once. The work continued. On the 6th day, Grady was carrying boards across the yard when a sound stopped him. A piece of lumber slipping from a stack and hitting the frozen ground with a flat, heavy crack. The sound echoed off the barn walls. His body tightened. The old familiar response, muscles locking, breath catching, the world beginning to narrow toward that single sharp point where the present disappears and the past rushes in to fill the vacuum. But this time, something different happened. Before the desert could form behind his eyes, before the sand could replace the snow, and the blood could replace the mud, and the voice of his dead friend could begin calling his name from a place he could never reach, Grady breathed. He breathed in, counted, 1, 2, 3, 4. He breathed out, counted, 1, 2, 3, 4. The barn stayed. The cold air stayed. The sound of hammers and voices and wind through pine trees stayed. The desert did not come. Not because it was gone. It would never be gone. But because for the first time in years, something else was stronger. The present was louder than the past. The life he was building was more real than the life that had broken him. Cota was at his side anyway. The dog had crossed the yard the instant Grady's body stiffened. He pressed against Grady's leg and placed his head against his thigh. The familiar weight, the familiar warmth, the anchor that had held him through every storm since the day they met. But Grady was already back, already present, already here. He reached down and scratched behind Cota's ear. "I am okay, buddy," he said. And for the first time in 14 months, the words were not a lie he told to keep the dog from worrying. They were true. He was okay. Not healed, not fixed, not the man he had been before the desert, but okay. Standing on solid ground in a place that needed him, surrounded by people who had chosen to be here with a dog who would never leave. Cota tilted his head slightly, studying him, making sure. Then the dog relaxed, his tail wagged. His tongue came out briefly the way it did when something pleased him. He had checked and the result was satisfactory. His partner was present. The mission could continue. "Yeah," Grady said quietly. "I know. Back to work." On the 9th day, they were almost done. The barn stood complete in every way that mattered. Walls solid, roof sealed. The main door, a wide sliding panel built from reclaimed wood that Silas had sanded smooth over 3 evenings, hung in its track, ready to be opened. Inside the animal treatment area was framed according to Dr. Linnea Frost's specifications. Stalls lined the north wall. A storage room occupied the back corner. The center of the barn was open and sunlit exactly as Frank Beckett had drawn it 15 years ago. The morning light came through the east windows and fell across the floor in long golden rectangles. It was beautiful. Not in the way expensive things are beautiful. Beautiful the way things are when they have been built by hand and stubborn refusal to let 2 dead men stream stay dead. Bert's final sign hung beside the main door. He had used real wood this time. Carved the letters with a pocket knife. It read, "Weston Beckett Refuge." Below that, in smaller letters, "Built by volunteers, supervised by Cota." That afternoon, they hung the door. Grady stood inside the barn with his hand on the handle. Everyone else stood in the yard. Norah Beckett was there. She had come every day since the morning she sat down on the hay bale and stayed. She stood slightly apart from the group Frank's notebook held against her chest the way she always held it, but her posture was different now. She was not clutching it for comfort. She was holding it up, like a witness, like proof. Grady pulled the handle. The door resisted. The track was stiff from new wood that had not yet settled into its groove. The panel moved an inch, 2 inches. Then it stopped, stuck. Silence filled the yard. Grady pulled again. The door held. He braced his feet and leaned his weight into it. His left knee sent a bolt of pain up through his thigh. The door did not move. For a terrible moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the pine trees. The lake glinted in the distance. 9 days of work, 9 days of sweat and pain, and the impossible faith of people who had chosen to believe that this barn could be built in time. And now the door would not open. Then Silas stepped forward. Without a word, he placed his hands beside Grady's on the handle. Then Bert. Then Ridley. Then Dr. Frost. Then Norah Beckett, who let Frank's notebook rest on the ground for the first time in 3 years, and placed both her hands on the cold metal beside the others. 6 people and 1 handle. They pulled together. The door groaned. The wood protested. The track shifted. And then, with a sound that seemed to come from the building itself, the barn door slid open. Light poured in. Not just sunlight. Something larger than sunlight. Something that had been waiting 15 years to enter this space and was finally being allowed through. It fell across the floor in a wide golden sheet and touched every wall and every beam and every corner that had once been dark. Silas smiled, not a half smile, not a controlled expression, a full, genuine, unguarded smile that changed the geography of his face and made the scar along his temple look like something that belonged to another man in another life. It was the first time anyone had seen him smile. Bert did not make a joke. He raised both fists above his head and shouted something wordless and triumphant that echoed off the hills and sent birds scattering from the nearest pine trees. Ridley Nash stood perfectly still. Tears ran down his face, and he did not wipe them. He let them fall. He let them be seen. The man who had arrived on foot with nothing but a faded jacket and the hope that someone might let him be useful stood in the golden light of a barn he had helped build and cried without shame. Doctor. Linnea Frost nodded once, a single controlled movement that meant in her precise and practical language, "This is good work, and it will last." Norah Beckett picked up Frank's notebook from the ground. She held it against her chest, but she was not crying. She was looking at the barn with an expression that held no grief in it at all, only recognition, only the quiet, fierce joy of seeing something that had lived only in paper and pencil and imagination for 15 years, standing now in wood and stone and light, real, solid, finished. "Frank," she whispered, not to anyone in the yard, to someone else. Someone who was not there but who she needed to know anyway. "They built it. They built your barn." Cota stood in the center of the open doorway. The sunlight fell around him. His sable coat glowed. His ears stood tall, and his amber eyes were bright, and his head was lifted in the posture he held when something important had been completed. Not the alert of danger, not the urgency of a search. The quiet, satisfied certainty of a mission accomplished. His tail wagged, slowly, steadily, the way it did when the world was for one moment exactly as it should be. Then from the bottom of the hill came the sound of engines. Not one, several. Grady stepped out of the barn and looked down the gravel road. Trucks, pickup trucks, 5 of them, then 7, then more. They climbed the hill in a slow procession, tires crunching on gravel engines rumbling in the cold air. They parked along the fence and the road and the edge of the yard wherever they could find space. People stepped out, men and women Grady had never met, faces he did not recognize. They carried tools, lumber, paint, food wrapped in foil. They walked up the hill toward the barn with the quiet determination of people who had made a decision together and were not interested in explaining it. Harold walked at the front, the man from the hardware store who had known Arthur Weston for 30 years. He stopped in front of Grady and looked at the barn. His eyes were red. His jaw was set. "Your grandfather fixed half the roofs in this town," Harold said. "Never sent a single bill. Never asked for a thing." He looked at the crowd behind him. "We are here to finish what he started. Every one of us." They came, 20 people, then 30. They painted the barn, built a fence around the animal yard, laid gravel on the path from the road to the door. Someone brought a hand-carved sign that read, "Weston Beckett Refuge," in letters that would last for decades. Someone else brought flowers. It was still too cold for planting, but they set the pots along the porch of the mansion and the barn door, and suddenly the place looked alive in a way that no amount of lumber and nails could achieve. In the stalls along the north wall, Rusty lay on fresh straw. His bandage was gone now. The leg had healed. Not perfectly. He would always carry a slight limp, a memory written into the body that the body would never fully release. But he walked without pain, and he no longer flinched when strangers approached. Cota lay beside him. The kitten slept between them, so small it almost disappeared in the straw. 3 animals in a barn that had been empty a month ago. The first residents of a refuge that did not yet have a name on paper, but already had a purpose that paper could never contain. Norah Beckett stood near the main door watching the crowd of townspeople work. Frank's notebook was in her coat pocket. She no longer held it against her chest. She carried it now the way a person carries a book they have finished reading. Not because they need it anymore, but because they are not ready to put it on the shelf. She looked at the barn, and her eyes were dry and clear. She turned to Grady. "I would like to file the paperwork," she said, "to register this as a non-profit community refuge." Frank and Arthur had started the process years ago. The forms are still in Frank's desk at home. I kept them. She paused. "If you are ready." Grady looked at the barn, at the people, at Cota sitting in the center of the doorway with sunlight falling across his sable coat. He thought about his grandfather's notebook and the line written at the bottom of the last page. "Show him this land belongs to something bigger than money." "I am ready," he said. The sound of an engine came from the bottom of the hill, different from the trucks, smoother, quieter, the kind of engine that belonged to a car that cost more than most of the homes in Alder Ridge. Vernon Tate's black car appeared on the gravel road. The car climbed the hill slowly. It stopped near the gate. The engine idled. Through the tinted windshield, Grady could see Vernon sitting behind the wheel, his face turned toward the barn, toward the crowd, toward the 30 people carrying tools and lumber and paint cans across the yard of a property he had spent a decade trying to acquire. Vernon did not get out. He sat in the car and looked at the community that had formed around a piece of land he believed was worth $800,000. He looked at the sign above the barn door. Weston Beckett Refuge. He looked at the old trucks parked along the fence, each one belonging to someone who had driven here before dawn to finish what 2 dead men had started. He looked at the children running between the vehicles and the women carrying food and the men whose hands were rough with sawdust and whose faces carried the particular expression of people who had discovered, perhaps for the first time, that building something together felt more valuable than anything they had ever owned alone. He sat there for a long time. The engine idled. The exhaust made small white clouds in the cold air. Then the car turned slowly around. The tires crunched on gravel. The black vehicle rolled back down the hill and disappeared around the bend, and the sound of the engine faded into the forest and did not return. No door opened. No offer was made. Vernon Tate drove away from Aldervale Manor for the last time. Not because he had been defeated by lawyers or contracts, because he had been defeated by something he had no strategy for. A community, a purpose, a barn full of people who had decided together that this piece of ground belonged to something that could not be purchased. The barn was finished. The refuge was real. That evening, the town held a gathering on the grounds of Alder Vale. It was not planned. It simply happened. Someone brought a grill. Someone brought music from a portable speaker. Children ran between the trucks while their parents talked in small groups and looked at the barn with expressions that ranged from pride to wonder to the quiet emotion of people who had not realized how much they needed to build something together until they were standing inside it. Grady moved through the crowd slowly. His knee ached from 9 days of work without rest, and each step carried the specific pain of a body that had given everything it had. But the pain did not bother him tonight. Tonight, the pain was evidence, proof that he had done something real, built something real, stayed somewhere real. For the first time in 14 months, the pain in his body was not a reminder of what he had lost. It was a record of what he had built. He accepted handshakes from people he had never met. An old woman in a green coat told him his grandfather had fixed her porch railing 20 years ago and never let her pay. A young couple said they had driven 40 minutes from the next town because they heard what was happening and wanted to be part of it. A man with a gray ponytail pressed a thermos of hot cider into Grady's hands and said simply, "Welcome home, son." The words hit harder than anything Vernon Tate had ever offered. Bert had set up a table near the barn door with food that people had brought, casseroles and bread and pies and a pot of chili that he claimed to have made himself, but which doctor? Linnea Frost quietly confirmed had been purchased from the diner. Bert did not deny it. He simply shrugged and said, "Leadership means knowing when to delegate, Dr. Frost." Dr. Frost almost smiled. Almost. The gathering had the feeling of something that had not been planned but had always been intended. As if the valley had been waiting for this evening, the way the barn had been waiting for its walls. The way the notebooks had been waiting for someone to read them. The way Cota had been waiting at the door. Then Grady noticed the boy near the edge of the gathering. Small, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Standing apart from the other children with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets and his shoulders drawn up around his ears. The boy flinched when a group of men nearby laughed loudly. His whole body tightened and his eyes went wide, and for a moment he looked exactly like a soldier Grady had once known, who could not walk through a market without pressing his back against the nearest wall. Grady walked over. Slowly. No sudden movements. He sat down on the grass beside the boy, lowering himself carefully until they were at the same height. He did not speak immediately. He just sat there, present, close, the way Cota always was. The boy glanced at him, then away, then back. "Loud, isn't it?" Grady said quietly. The boy nodded. His jaw was tight. "You know what I do when things get too loud," Grady said. He kept his voice low and steady. "I breathe. In for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. My friend taught me that." He looked toward the barn. Cota was walking through the gathering, moving between people, accepting pats and scratches with the calm dignity of a dog who understood that his job was never finished. When Grady looked at him, Cota changed direction, crossed the yard, walked directly to the boy, and sat down beside him. The boy stared at the dog. Cota lowered his head slowly and rested it on his front paws. His amber eyes looked up at the child with the same patience and warmth they had shown Norah Beckett on the porch, and Ridley Nash on the barn floor, and Grady Weston on every dark night when the world had narrowed to a single point of pain. "His name is Cota," Grady said. "He wants you to know you are safe." The boy reached out. His small hand touched the fur between Cota's ears. Cota did not move, did not flinch, just breathed. Slowly, steadily. The same rhythm he had used to bring Grady back from the desert. the same rhythm he had offered to every broken thing he had ever encountered. The boy's shoulders lowered, his jaw unclenched, his breathing slowed to match the dog's. Grady watched, and in that moment on the grass beside a barn that two dead men had dreamed about sitting next to a child he had never met, and a dog who had saved his life more times than he could count, the circle completed itself. He had been broken, he had been healed, and now he was healing someone else. Not with medicine, not with words, with presence, with the simple act of sitting beside someone who was afraid and saying without saying anything, "I know. I have been there. You are not alone." Later, near the barn wall, Silas Harmon stood alone. He faced a small wooden plaque that someone had mounted that afternoon. The plaque listed the names of veterans from Alder Ridge who had served and not returned. 12 names. At the bottom, added in fresh paint that was still slightly wet, was a 13th. Marcus Harmon. Fallujah. 22 years old. Silas stood in front of his son's name. He did not speak. He did not move. He simply stood there with one weathered hand pressed flat against the wood. His fingers trembled slightly against the letters. Cota walked to him. The dog sat beside the old Marine and leaned against his leg. The same lean, the same warmth, the same unspoken sentence that had held Grady together through the darkest night of his life. Silas looked down at the dog. His face crumpled, not entirely, just at the edges, the places where 14 years of carrying his son's death alone had worn the deepest grooves. He placed his hand on Cota's head. "Good dog," he whispered. His voice was rough and broken and full. Cota pressed harder against his leg. And Silas Harmon, who had not cried in front of another living soul since the day they told him his boy was gone, let one tear fall. Just one. It caught the light from the barn and held it for a moment before it dropped. The gathering lasted until dark. People left slowly. Trucks rolled down the hill one by one, headlights cutting through the evening mist that rose from the warming lake. Voices faded. Music stopped. The yard emptied until only the quiet remained. Grady stood on the porch of Alder Manor. The barn was a dark shape against the sky, solid and real. Inside it, Rusty slept on clean straw, with the kitten curled against his ribs. The animals were safe. The refuge was built. The dream that Arthur Weston and Frank Beckett had carried for 15 years existed now in wood and stone and light. Norah Beckett stood beside the porch railing. She had stayed after the others left. She looked out across the valley where the lake reflected the first stars of the evening. Her face was calm. Not empty calm, full calm. The calm of a woman who had set down something heavy after carrying it for a very long time. Frank always said, "Dogs know things we do not," she said. Her voice was quiet and warm. He said they can feel the shape of a place before it is built. They can tell when something is home before the people figure it out. She looked at Cota. The dog sat beside Grady, his amber eyes reflecting the stars. "Dogs know the way home," Norah said. Grady looked at the mansion behind him. Warm light glowed from the windows. The stove was lit. The 2 notebooks lay on the kitchen table, closed now. Finished. The house smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the bread someone had left on the counter during the gathering. Through the open barn door, he could see the sign, Weston Beckett Refuge. The letters caught the last of the light. Home. He had spent 14 months running from it, running from every place that might ask him to stay. running from every person who might ask him to care, running from the terrifying possibility that he might love something he could lose. And a dog had stood in front of a door and said, no. Home was not a house. Home was not a town or a lake or a barn built from old wood and new sweat. Home was the place where the pain did not have to be carried alone. Home was the place where broken things were allowed to heal at their own pace. Home was a porch in the evening with a dog beside you and stars above you, and the knowledge that tomorrow there would be work to do and people to do it with, and a reason to get out of bed that had nothing to do with surviving and everything to do with living. Grady understood now what his grandfather's letter had meant. Come home before you decide what this house is worth. The house was not worth $800,000. It was not worth any number that could be written on a page. It was worth every person who would someday walk through that barn door carrying something too heavy to carry alone. It was worth every animal that would find shelter inside those walls. It was worth the life of every broken soldier who would sit on that porch and look out at the lake and feel, perhaps for the first time since coming home, that they had arrived somewhere that wanted them. Norah placed her hand briefly on Grady's shoulder. The touch was light. The weight of it was not. It carried the gratitude of a woman who had spent 3 years wondering if her husband's dream would die with her. And the answer, standing in wood and stone on the hill where 2 old friends had planned it over coffee and graph paper, was no, it would not die. Not today. Not ever. Arthur always said, God works in quiet ways, Norah said. Not through lightning or grand signs, through doors that open when we feel lost, through paths that appear when we are ready to stop running. She looked at Cota, through creatures who love us better than we love ourselves. Then she walked down the steps and along the path toward the road. Her silhouette moved slowly against the darkening sky. She did not look back. She did not need to. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be built had been built. Grady sat down on the top step. Cota lay beside him. The dog rested his head across Grady's boot the way he had done on the first night they arrived. The weight was the same. The warmth was the same. But everything else was different. They sat together as the last light left the sky and the stars came out one by one over the frozen valley that was slowly, steadily, inevitably turning toward spring. After a long time, Cota lifted his head. His ears rotated forward. His nose twitched. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, his body suddenly alert, his amber eyes focused on something in the distance. The north wind, coming down from the mountains, carrying a scent that only he could read. Grady watched him. What is it? Cota did not turn around. His tail moved once. His ears held forward. He stared into the dark northern sky with the focused attention of a dog who had detected something far away. Something that needed finding. Something that was waiting. Grady smiled. It was a small smile. Tired, real. Again, he said. Cota looked back at him. The amber eyes held steady. The tail wagged once more. And in the language they had shared since the beginning, the language that needed no words and never would, the answer was simple and clear and absolutely certain. Always. The wind moved through the pine trees. The lake turned silver under the stars. The barn stood solid on the hill, its door open, its light waiting. And somewhere out in the dark northern night, carried on the cold wind that had crossed 1,000 miles of forest and mountain to reach this valley, there was a scent, a direction, a new beginning. Grady thought about the 10-year-old boy who had sat on these same steps with a fishing pole and told his grandfather he wanted to protect people. That boy had not known what the promise would cost. He had not known about the deserts or the helicopters or the 30 seconds that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had not known that protecting people sometimes meant letting them protect you first. That coming home sometimes meant finding a home you did not know you had. That the bravest thing a soldier could do was not charge into battle, but sit on a porch with a dog and admit that he was tired, and let someone help him carry what he could not carry alone. But the boy had been right about one thing. He had grown up to be someone who protects people, just not in the way he imagined. Not with weapons or missions or the precision of special operations training, with a hammer, with a barn, with the willingness to stay. If you are carrying something heavy tonight, know this: you do not have to carry it alone. Sometimes all it takes is one step, one door that opens, one loyal friend who stands beside you and says, "I am not leaving." Tell us in the comments, who is the loyal friend who helped you keep going? What was the door that opened for you? If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need it today. And subscribe so you will not miss the next one. May you find your way home. And may someone who loves you be waiting there when you arrive.